Hello and welcome. Today's webinar is Mobility for the People, Equity Requirements across 239 U.S. shared micromobility programs. My name is Lacey Friedley. I am the Communications Coordinator at Portland State University's Transportation Research and Education Center. TREC leads the National Institute for Transportation and Communities, a university transportation center funded by the U.S. Department of Transportation. NITC consortium members are the University of Utah, University of Oregon, University of Arizona, University of Texas at Arlington, and the Oregon Institute of Technology. NITC's research priority is improving mobility of people and goods to build strong communities. Our presenter today is Anne Brown of the University of Oregon. She's an assistant professor in the School of Planning, Public Policy and Management at the University of Oregon. She researches issues of transportation equity, shared mobility, and travel behavior. Before diving into the webinar, I'd like to let you know about another upcoming online event. On October 20th, we'll be hosting a webinar about the Wasatch Transportation Academy. Presenters will be Nathan McNeil of PSU, Keith Bartholomew of the University of Utah, Andrea Olson of the Utah DOT, Laura Hansen of the Utah Governor's Office of Planning and Budget, and Tui Tu of Tui Tu Consulting. This presentation will be about 40 minutes long, then we will have 15 minutes to answer your questions. During the presentation, please submit your questions via the Zoom Q&A. After the webinar, you will receive an email with a link to the video recording and presentation slides. If you are tracking professional development hours, this webinar is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit. A certificate of completion will be posted on the event page within 24 hours after the webinar ends. And with that, I'll turn it over to our presenter.
Great, thanks, Lacey, and welcome everyone. Okay, let's get started. So as Lacey said, my name is Anne Brown. I'm here presenting research called Mobility for the People, Equity Requirements across 239 U.S. shared micromobility programs. I'm presenting on behalf of myself and my collaborator, Amanda Howell of the Urbanism Next Center at the University of Oregon. This wasn't just an effort between the two of us. It was also an effort so funded by NITC, of course, which is why we're here, but an effort of U of O students, as well as a number of transportation professionals. So Zoe Green, Hannah Krieger, Clarissa Kabensagen, Rio Ojas, Duncan Huang, and John Larson Friend. So it really was a team effort across a number of people. So I want to start out by just explaining a little bit about why did we do this project, what motivated the research that you'll then hear about. So the research is focused on shared mobility and equity requirements. And Amanda and I, so my colleague Amanda, have been researching micromobility, equity, and transportation for years at this point. And one of the things we continually saw and see in research and in practice is that there's intersectional barriers that still remain to accessing shared micromobility services. So that has to do with where people live, the transportation challenges people face, the personal identities, right? A whole host of factors. And cities and agencies have often approached those barriers and sought to overcome them through a variety of ways. The two primary ones being both equity frameworks to think about how to structure and build programs to overcome any barriers to access. And then implementing different program requirements as well to actually operationalize equity into micromobility. Despite the fact that we know of a whole host of places that have been working on this, we didn't have a good sense of how prevalent are these requirements and how can cities and agencies really evaluate their equity programs. So these are the motivating questions really to this research. And in this webinar, I'm going to be presenting on two different slices of the research and then two very practice-oriented and interactive tools that we can use and you can use to actually use this research in practice in a very accessible way, not just reading through our, albeit very informative, 100-page report. So the two pieces I'll be presenting on today is one, equity and shared micromobility programs. And that is looking at what are the requirements currently in place, how common are they, what share of programs have these requirements. And I'll walk you through as well an interactive dashboard we created to enable you to really sift through these, make comparisons across places, see what the requirements are in individual cities. So I'll introduce this interactive dashboard. The second piece was creating a shared micromobility equity framework. And so this was looking at how do agencies or cities take the program they have and actually evaluate it for a number of different dimensions of equity in order to think about what are we doing really well, where are there areas to improve, and then what are the concrete ways or example languages that we can use to actually iterate our programs. And this culminated in an evaluation tool. It's an online, again, interactive and customizable tool. So I'll walk through both of these. When I get to the end, right before Q&A, I will put links in the chat to both of these tools, as well as an email link that you can have these tools emailed directly to you, and a link to the report that really provides all the background and detail on how we create these tools. I'll go over some of the background and detail now, but if you want all the nitty-gritty, it's in the report and freely available. Okay, so let's start with what are the equity requirements in shared micromobility programs in the US and this interactive dashboard we created. So motivating questions for this dashboard specifically and this big database we built of equity requirements was, what are the requirements? And how often do programs actually include different types of shared micromobility equity requirements? So we just didn't have a sense of how frequently are these are different requirements required, which ones are more common, which ones less common, and where are they? We also wanted to know how are programs actually evaluating and monitoring the requirements to ensure that any requirements that are in place actually have a tangible outcome and effect on practice and uptake and use among the community. How did we create this large database? So in total, we did collect data on 239 US shared micromobility programs. To our knowledge, is the most comprehensive database of equity requirements in shared micromobility programs. We did, I want to caveat, collect requirements. We did not collect voluntary, say, equity programs. So we collected information across 3 dimensions of equity. These will come up again later when I talk about the evaluation tool. But we collected data related to process equity, so that has to do with goal setting or targeted market and outreach, implementation equity. So thinking about the kind of programmatic requirements in place that might be on the social side, reducing fare, requiring the website or app in multiple languages. Could also be spatial requirements, so thinking about the distribution of vehicles across space. And then evaluation, so on the data sharing requirements where they're enforcement related to equity, and then evaluation reports. So the 239 programs, this includes bike share programs, it includes e-scooter programs, and it includes programs that group those together into a shared micromobility service. So I mentioned that we are only looking at requirements. So we were gathering information from program websites, permit applications, municipal code, RFPs, RFIs, any kind of rulemaking documents. In some cases, those were available on program or city websites. In other cases, this were through email contact with city staff or agency staff members. So if you were one of those people we emailed to get information on these programs, thank you for helping us build this comprehensive database. So as we read these different municipal and regulatory language, we again were looking for requirements. So we were looking for language that you must do this, companies shall do this, you should do this. We didn't include any language that said companies may do something. We didn't include, for example, let's say an operator voluntarily provides reduced fares for people earning lower incomes. We didn't include any of these voluntary sides. We really wanted to see where are cities and agencies and organizations putting the requirement, where are they putting their efforts and ensuring that this is part of programs. And there's a whole host of nuance here. Again, I'll talk about a little bit of that. Happy to get into it more in the Q&A. And there's more detail in the report. The last piece I'll say about the methods and who we included in the sample is we excluded any university programs. So if there's an e-scooter program, a bike share that's run by a university, we excluded those programs. They're just a different program, really. And when we're looking at targeting, say, marginalized communities, people are historically underserved, that tends to be just a different group from university students. And so we wanted to really focus on a whole city or community level. Before I introduce some of the specific findings and what share of programs had different equity requirements, I want to note that programs evolve over time. I think anyone in this space realizes how quickly shared micromobility changes, both the companies or the operators in a market, what that program looks like, especially when we're doing pilots and programs are evolving every single year. So this really is a snapshot in time. I'll provide an opportunity later. I'll show you where, if anything is, if you find that the dashboard is outdated in your city, we have places for you to provide some update there. But this is a snapshot basically updated as of this spring, so quite recent. I'll note too that the requirements you see, we spent quite a long time talking to 5 different staff from 5 different cities. And there's a lot more nuance in the report about how the requirements that we'll just mention in these broad categories, like percentage of cities that have X, Y, and Z requirement. A lot of these don't just happen, right? They're part of a long process, either a political planning process, to actually enact these requirements. They're often shaped by local constraints. So that might be the physical infrastructure cities have, staff capacity, perceived competitiveness of the market. So in other words, whether a city or community or agency thinks they can even ask or require different elements or different components from private companies. So again, for more nuanced insights from the case studies, I'm happy to go through these some in the Q&A, but also there's a lot more detail in the report that I will link out at the end. Okay, so I'm going to present the different requirements across 3 dimensions of equity that I'd already mentioned: process, implementation, and evaluation. Overall, we saw that 62%, so nearly 2/3 of program, had at least one equity requirement. Okay, so when I present, for example, that about 1/3 of different companies had, or under 1/3, 29% had targeted marketing outreach requirements, that does not to say that other programs didn't have other types of requirements, right? Some programs had no equity requirements, about 1/3. Some had 1, some had 2. More rarely did programs have a lot of, multiple equity requirements, so more in the 6 and 7 range. But there's a really, really wide range about the types of requirements different programs include, the number of requirements, and then the combination of those requirements, and the specific language underpinning those. So I'll kind of dig into some of these. But starting us off, 29% had targeted marketing outreach requirements. This isn't to say, broad outreach requirements. Generally, this was really, again, targeted. So focusing on populations that are historically underserved, marginalized, or specifically called out in the RFP, in the RFI, and other documentation. Looking at implementation, I'll walk through just really pretty quickly a series of different implementation requirements. And remember, again, as I present these, that some cities have only this requirement, or some programs, some have multiple of these. Everyone has its own unique combination. So about 1/3 of cities or programs required alternatives to smartphones. About 1/3 required there to be a cash option to pay for trips. About 1/3, again, all slightly different numbers, but pretty close, required there to be reduced rate. And I'll talk about some of the nuance behind these. 30% had a geographic component, meaning that they mandated a certain distribution of vehicles, so scooters or bikes or both, across space. And those were typically either focused on the demographics of certain neighborhoods, or in some cases, a program would have already defined, say, an equity area, often in line with a broader city effort to, acknowledge the historical, say, disinvestment in neighborhoods or the transportation barriers in certain areas. About a quarter of programs require services to be offered in multiple languages, and then just 5% required adaptive vehicles as part of the programming. So these are the implementation side. This is really getting a program on the ground and out to potential riders. And this is, I would say overall, this is for all programs, right? So this is for scooters, bikes, and shared micromobility programs. Generally, we see these numbers pretty consistent across the different modes. We see greater uptake and greater use of equity requirements in the shared micromobility programs. Those are the combined bike and scooter programs, followed by scooter programs, and followed by bike share. That's, I think, largely an artifact of the age of the different programs. And we can think about the broader forces and greater attention to equity over time. So it's not inherent to the mode, it's more a reflection of the time that these different programs were launched. Okay, on the evaluation side, the greatest requirement that we observed across all programs was the requirement to share data. So the private companies who are having permits or service contracts with communities, agencies, or cities, 83% were required to share data. That's a pretty stark contrast to only about a quarter of the programs that had a public-facing evaluation report. So it leaves a lot of question of, what's happening between the data requirement side and then the evaluation side. It could be that internal evaluation is occurring, and that likely is the case, but it's rarely then reaching the public, or much less frequently reaching the public. And then about 15% of the programs had equity-related enforcement. And so this is related to things like adjusting the number of vehicles. For example, a company is allowed to operate based on their performance across different equity requirements or quotas. Okay, before I move on to the tool, the equity evaluation tool, I want to just highlight some of the nuance that goes into each of these, right? These are big buckets of requirements. So data sharing requirement, right? That's a big bucket. There's a lot of different language that goes into that single requirement and a lot of variation across cities. So I want to use an example from a reduced rate in 2 different cities. So I want to start and just show how different these often look like in regulatory language. So Austin, for example, requires that operators provide a reduced rate, and they stipulate that this has to be available to people earning at or below 200% of the federal poverty guidelines. Okay, so it's a pretty broad requirement. SFMTA, by contrast, requires that a very specific discount be provided. So either they stipulate that the companies must provide a 50% fare discount, or unlimited trips under 30 minutes for that same group of riders, so those earning 200% of the federal poverty guidelines. So again, just very different approaches throughout. I'm going to switch over to the dashboard quickly so you can all see what really this looks like in a kind of dynamic and interactive interface, and then highlight how you can really see this different language. So you should now be able to see my dashboard. So this is what it really looks like coming up. If you pull up the dashboard, so you can see there's an introduction, how to navigate. There's a place I mentioned to submit an update. So for example, let's say you're looking at this map and you say, oh, we just started a new micromobility program. It's not listed on this map. This is a place for you to let us know that your program exists, or you've had a new RFP, the program requirements have been updated. This will allow us to keep it up to date. We're going to be doing that on our own, but this just makes our jobs a little easier to make sure this continues to be a really up-to-date and useful resource for people. So you'll notice then there's a map here of all 239 programs in the database we have. You can hover over any one of them and you'll see, for example, Laramie, Wyoming. You can see they have a scooter share, who operates, the type of operating structure, and then the types of requirements that are either required or not required in this system. One of the things we were really excited about for this dashboard is you can also filter it based on your own interests. So let's say you want to know, okay, what are other, say, scooter programs doing? So you can filter it so that only scooter programs actually show up on the map. You say, okay, this is great. I'm a small community. I want to know what are other smaller communities doing. You can adjust the population. So let's say right now it goes from 7,000 to 800, let's see, 8 million. I'm going to drag it all the way down. So I'm looking at pretty small communities, let's say under 50,000. Okay, so if I do that, you can see quite a few dots disappeared. Now these are all the programs that have e-scooter share and are under 58,000 people. Let's say I want to know only which programs have at least one equity requirement. I can click yes. Notice again, the map is updated. And then again, there's all these different filters to look at the different requirements. So you can click through and adjust it to then narrow your filter as much as you want to look at different examples and look at programs that might be similar to those you're interested in. Or maybe you're I'm in Eugene, Oregon. Maybe I want to see what Portland is doing. I want to see what my neighboring community is doing. So I can really target specific areas or similar programs in order to have a sense of what are other places doing, or who are the places who have all these different standards that maybe I want to take more of a look at. Okay, the other piece that we're excited about is each of these will then link down to a really comprehensive database. And so it'll list the program detail, the city and region, and then all the information about the program. So if there's no equity requirements, it'll say right there. If there are equity requirements in place, we will have language or exactly what it specifies. So the specific language that this program uses is included in the database. All the data can be downloaded at the bottom of the dashboard. This will include the specific linked sourcing as well. So I'll just show you what that looks like. It's basically a big Excel table. It's not as fun to use as the dashboard, which is why we created the dashboard. It's a lot easier to filter and scroll. But if you want all the nitty-gritty detail, you want to pull this out into Excel and analyze it yourself. If you want to scroll over and see all the specific sources, so 2019 license agreement, a staff email, you can link all of these to see what is the original sourcing, what is the original language that comes with each of these programs. So again, we're hopeful that this will be a really helpful resource to either those of you thinking about creating a new program, thinking about iterating programs, very interactive and easy to use. So that's the piece number one for this project. So moving back, and then I'm going to migrate over to the framework and the evaluation tool we developed, and then open it up to questions. Okay, so the evaluation tool that we created was in response to thinking about how to actually evaluate programs once they're on the ground. And we did this in conjunction with Hannah Krieger at the Greenlining Institute. So she was one of our key partners in developing this new framework for evaluating programs. We started really with that core from Greenlining. They're making equity real in mobility pilots framework. But this is really a forward-looking tool. It's not necessarily meant for evaluation. So we took a lot of its core principles and adapted it into an evaluation framework. We created first a static framework. So it had 4 different components around program structure and context, aligning with community needs, program design, program evaluation, iteration. And this is really just scratching the surface. Each of these is essentially a choose your own adventure. So any yes or no kind of triggers a whole separate subset of questions. But while we were excited by all the content in this, we also realized it's not the most accessible. So even probably you looking at this are going, ooh, there's a lot of information here, right? Your eyes could be glazing, and that's not what we want. We want it to be a usable tool. So I'll get to how we got there. But we presented this static tool to our technical advisory committee. These are people with expertise in shared micromobility, with transportation equity, with community empowerment. And we asked them, what does this feedback look right? What are we missing? How should it be ordered? And we took the feedback from that technical advisory committee, which we received, I think, 3 or 4 times, and continually adapted that evaluation framework. So it met both a transportation equity lens, but also a community empowerment lens, and thinking about how do we actually, realize equity in transportation practice. So taking that feedback, taking that static form, we created an online and customizable equity evaluation tool. So I'll quickly present just a bit about what this looks like so you can get a sense of, if you were to use this tool, what can you expect to get out of it and what can you expect it to look like? So this tool, it's basically operationalize that static framework into a practice-ready and user-friendly micromobility equity evaluation tool. So the goal of this is to really enable and empower cities and agencies to evaluate their own programs across, again, these three dimensions of equity: process, implementation, and evaluation, in order to both understand where one's program strengths are, where there's opportunities for additional iteration and evolution, and then also provide some, again, very tangible, concrete language and guidance and policy language to actually implement in the next round. So we're not just saying, okay, you're doing fine, good luck, right? We're saying, here are concrete ways and promising approaches for how you could integrate different language to really take your program to the next level. So again, very much oriented at practice and implementation. So what does this tool look like? It walks you through a whole series of questions. Some ask you about program components itself. So this is an example. I've used Peace Health Rides, which is the local bike share here in Eugene, Oregon, as an example. So we say, okay, we have used, what type of equity goals do you have? Based on the answers you provide about your program, the tool goes down different pathways. So again, it's a bit of a choose your own adventure. You'll see different follow-up based questions based on your responses. It's very customized to your own context. So some are going to be essentially selection questions like this one. Others are more open-ended, qualitative questions to ask staff or ask you as the survey taker to reflect more on the process that your agency or organization or city went through in creating and implementing the micromobility program that you're evaluating. We estimate that the tool will take between 20 and 45 minutes. This is a big range. We realize it's really going to depend on your familiarity with the program. For example, if you maybe just started your position and working with your micromobility program, say last week, you might not know all the answers to the different details of your component, what its requirements are, maybe what the engagement process looked like. Similarly, the open-ended questions, the length of time it'll take you to complete this evaluation will really depend on how much detail you provide there. If you don't have the full time, or you run out of time doing this tool, you can save your progress and return to the evaluation at a later time. At the end, the tool provides a customized program score and then a promising approaches guide. So again, very customized to the answers you provide. Once you fill out the different questions associated with the tool, your program will get a score, either beginning, intermediate, and advanced, across, again, those three dimensions of equity: process, implementation, and evaluation. So I'll show you just really quick what that might look like. Here's a program that maybe scored an advanced on a process score. It will tell you why you scored that. So we'll say, what does that mean? We have an understanding score guide that unpacks why you scored what you did, the different thresholds for reaching beginner, intermediate, and advanced across the three equity areas, and then also how different program components are scored. And so you can really see what are the different elements that we could implement to raise, get our program to that next level. What are the different pieces that we can put together to, iterate this program so it is even more equity focused. Okay, so we have this understanding your score guide as well, so you know exactly why you scored what you did. And then we link the tool back to a promising approaches guide. And so this includes specific language from programs across the country with either strong requirements, strong language that include very specific language, and then links for any programs or cities looking for tangible and concrete resources to employ in the next iteration of their own program. So again, the goal of both of these tools was really to focus on specific and actionable tools that led to really tangible resources for implementation. Okay, so in creating these tools, again, we developed a large report. We do have a number of recommendations, kind of broad recommendations, takeaways that I'll conclude with before opening up for Q&A. The first was to link operational incentives to desired equity outcomes. And so this was largely from talking to city staff. So these are either incentives or deterrents, like adding or reducing fees based on certain goals, maybe increasing or decreasing fleet sizes, again, specifically linked to equity outcomes. Maybe an equity outcome is, the number of vehicles serving certain neighborhoods. Maybe it's enrollment in a reduced fare pass program. This is going to depend on, your specific context, your specific goals. But again, thinking about how there's some teeth and some carrots behind some of those equity goals you have. So how are you actually going to realize those? The next recommendation is dedicating staff time and resources to managing programs. We realize that this can be really challenging, especially for small communities. I think in general, we as transportation professionals are, at our maximum capacity in many cases. I myself live in a smaller city, so very much realize how our staff are often, have a lot on their plates. But from talking to program staff, both with and without capacity, having that dedicated time can really make an enormous difference in both thinking through and developing a program, iterating a program, and then actually being able to analyze and evaluate the program on the back end to then, further iterate a program. So when at all possible, thinking about how to gain additional staff time, maybe it's additional fees that on companies that can support that staff to improve the outcome for the cities or communities, for riders, and for the mobility companies themselves. Okay, next recommendation is to ensure a clear arc connects specific goals with program requirements. And I'll show you an example of basically a logic model table we've created. Again, you can find this in the report, but I just want to illustrate what I mean here, which is often we as meeting cities or programs have these big goals and these exciting goals for our programs, right? And so that might be making affordable transportation for all, for users. And so let's say, I'm just going to go over here, let's say our user goal is to serve people earning low incomes. And that's a great goal to have, but we need to make sure that that goal is backed up with specific program requirements. So we're not going to meet that goal if we're not providing, the different program elements to realize that in action. And so the green here, any green shaded cell, represents kind of the must-have requirements, and the yellow is the desirable elements. So for example, again, if we're looking for an affordable program, we're targeting people earning low incomes, we really need to have that low income or reduced fare. Based on what we know about, demographic data and smartphone adoption data and census data, we also know that people earning low incomes are less likely to have smartphones, and sometimes are spatially concentrated as well, often in the US with the level of segregation we have. In addition, cash payments with the amount unbanked populations as well. So thinking about connecting those program goals kind of in that vertical column to the different components of the program. So I'm going to move off of this somewhat busy slide, let you all dig more into it if you want in the report. Again, meant as a resource for thinking through operationalizing those goals into practice. We have a similar table that matches the program requirements with targeted data collection. So again, let's say that you have a program, you have a goal, you've matched it to a requirement. Well, how do you know if that's actually working? So if you want affordable transportation, you've implemented a low income fare program. Are you collecting data to actually enable you to evaluate if people are using it, how much they're using it, where are they using it? And so really creating that full arc to ensure that you know if it's working or if it's not working, and how you can then iterate it in the future to maximize the equity impacts and the uptake in practice. Okay, and then last but not least, conducting transparent evaluations to measure progress and identify future paths of improvement and iteration. Okay, so I want to thank you for all of you for your time. I'm going to put a number of links in the chat for resources that I raised during this presentation, and then I will look forward to Q&A with you all. Thanks.
Thank you. Great job, Anne. I see we do have a few questions coming in the Q&A box. Would you like me to read them, or can you all see them?
I'm pulling them up now.
Okay.
So I see one, the first question I see is, since the implementation equity was considered about 30%, were the equity options used overlapping? Yeah, so let's see, my stats are, we had 62% had at least one requirement. Of those, 3/4 had 2 or more requirements. I'm happy to get you very specific details if you want, or again, that database is fully available to you and you're welcome to crunch the numbers beyond the 2+. I will say that there were it's basically a diminishing number. So 62% had 1, about 50% had 2 or more, and then it gets lower and lower the more requirements you add on. There were a handful that had around 6 or 7 requirements, but it really ranges on the program itself. And the data were collected, they're up to date as of spring 2022. So we started collecting them a while ago, I think in maybe spring 2020, and then we kind of collected a first round, realized that very quickly things get out of date. So we updated it all, and that's why now it's it is a static resource. Our goal is to continue updating it, but again, if you all are working on for programs that either aren't on the dashboard because they're new, you see things that need to be updated, please let us know. We're going to be continually updating it to ensure it remains to be a reliable and up-to-date resource. Okay, I see Elliot's question. Thoughts about expanding the database to include sample RFP language, high needs area? Absolutely. That's something we did talk about doing. We do include RFP language. We link directly to RFPs. So we didn't include a sample RFP explicitly, just because we realized that communities have really different requirements and needs. I think that could be a great option, though. We can certainly talk about adding that. In the meantime, our hope is that, by looking at, for example, using the dashboard, you can filter different cities that have, say, maybe you want one that has, the maximum number of equity requirements. You have one that has, 6 or 7 equity requirements. You can then look and link to their RFP and see, okay, here's a city or a, program that has a lot of different requirements. What does their RFP actually look like? So there is some linking to the direct RFP language, if not a very specific, if not a separate example RFP. Dylan asked a question about, did you find evidence of programs being evaluated with user-based outcomes that you have in your tool? If so, who? That's a tricky one. There's definitely fewer. We have some of those linked in the dashboard. I can't remember all of them off the top of my head. The reason that's more challenging, of course, is because often that requires a whole different set of data, right? It typically requires user surveys. I think one of the most promising approaches we saw in that case was we saw quite a number of cities who, for example, who would build a survey themselves of questions they wanted to ask from the user-based outcomes, and then required the micromobility operator to send that to all users. So it enabled them to not have to go out and intercept random people in the street. They had the emails based on the micromobility providers, and as part of the contract and part of the operating agreement, it was usually about once a year, they were required to send a city designed or agency designed survey to users and then share that data back with them. So I think that's one of the most promising approaches I've seen cities use in terms of collecting data on user-based outcomes. Elizabeth asked, how does the evaluation tool score open-ended or qualitative questions? The frank answer is it doesn't. And that's because we simply don't have the coding software to really do that in real time. A lot of those are meant, again, really as reflective questions for the cities themselves. So a lot of it is the score is based on the quantitative, the open-ended reflection is based on, trying to think about how to get it to the next step, as both a brainstorming and thinking about what worked well, what didn't, but it's not actually used in scoring component. Okay, John. Hi, John. John is one of our collaborators. Says, I've engaged in negotiations with Bird on the behalf of the city of Issaquah. During negotiations, Bird took out the equity section took out our equity section at least 2 or 3 times, and you put it back in. What can we do about transportational professionals trying to push companies to be more open to equity requirements and make them the norm? It's a great question. We heard from this from other smaller communities in doing case study research. There was a lot of challenge in thinking about how many and how robust of requirements to include, particularly when they felt that they were getting really few applications to operate programs regardless. And so, for example, they worried that if they were getting only 2 applications to operate, even before putting any equity requirements in, if they start layering these requirements on top, they're just going to worry they're not going to have anyone applying. And so that's definitely a challenge. I think on one hand, pointing to, for example, if you have the dashboard, you can say, hey, look, here's a city that's our similar size. They have these requirements in place. Why can't we do that here? Or we need to do that here more assertively, right? And so pointing to other places, because on one hand, if these requirements have rolled on other places, certainly the micromobility companies have the ability to roll them out. There can be a cost associated with rolling these out for different micromobility companies. That's something Amanda and I will be working on in a future project. So we have this kind of teed up for the fall. So stay tuned. Hopefully it'll be another NITC project, which is really looking at, we've been in discussion with Bird and Lime to get data to actually look at which are the programs that are having the greatest uptake in different programs, which are the ones who are having basically the most quantifiable success in equity programs, and then actually talking to the people on the ground and saying, how exactly did this happen? What actually makes sense? How do you ensure that a requirement on paper goes to actual outcomes in practice, right? Because our hypothesis is you can have the same requirement on paper that has different uptake and different rollout in practice. And we want to really pinpoint what is it that makes requirements successful. And I think also to then, John, your point about the cost, right? If we can identify, maybe it's a requirement, right? But how do we ensure that it's cost efficient, or we're putting in the ones that are, maybe rather than like throwing every dart at the board, we're throwing the darts that actually maximize the equitable outcomes in practice. So that's one of our goals for future research. Clayton suggested expanding the toolkit to align all requirements. So photo ID verification, lock to curfews. I think that would be great. And saying many of these requirements unwittingly harm racial or economic equity. That's 100% true and a great point. I think, again, one of our goals for the future research is to really look at those and think about some of these additional equity requirements, or not to say explicitly equity requirements, but those that may have equity effects and outcomes as well, to evaluate those and be able to issue recommendations around those based on what we find in practice. And then Rebecca asked, what can cities learn from the intense focus on micromobility and apply it to automobiles? So acknowledging the very real challenge of dealing with a fleet of private versus shared vehicles, and autos are more likely to negatively impact community equity. That's a great point. I'm hoping, thinking about frameworks certainly could be applied to thinking about cars. One could take similar lessons and think about a whole host of different transportation policies or plans and apply them to different modes. We focus very specifically on micromobility in this project, in part because they are this, a really interesting mode in how they're contracted, and it's kind of this mix between private and public coordination. But they're certainly not unique in a lot of ways. And hopefully these lessons could be applied more broadly or adapted to be applicable to other modes as well. David asked, do you have an anecdote of a local agency who seems to be doing a really excellent job implementing equity requirements and achieving results? There are a lot that are doing really exciting work. I hesitate to name just one. I think, again, the dashboard highlights how there are a lot of different agencies doing exciting work. I mean, I'd say Eugene here is doing, our program is still about to be rolled out, but we have a pretty robust equity requirement program, but so do larger cities. So it's not necessarily a small versus a large city place. There's a lot of great examples across the board. One that I know both Amanda and I were inspired by, but is by no means the only place doing excellent work, was Baltimore. And I think that's in part due to a lot of staff time and passion for achieving equity in micromobility, and a lot of kind of going above and beyond even the requirements on paper to engage with the community, talk to people, get the word out about the services, and say things like reduced fare programs that people might not know about. If you were just living in a community, you might not be aware that these exist. Okay, there's a few, not necessarily questions, but comments about thinking about some of the challenges, and again, the tension between say the public interest and sometimes the private interests, and thinking about profit and social good and some of the tensions that might exist there, but also thinking about the opportunities that might exist, and the promoting kind of common goals across the public and private sector, and thinking about how we can work together to promote equity. There's another question about, does the dashboard include ADA micromobility options? It includes, we did not include questions about, say, accessible apps. And so things like, are the websites or the apps available and accessible via screen reader? Do the websites meet accessible different design guidelines? But we did include a requirement about adaptive vehicles. Okay.
Great. I do have one more follow-up question.
Sure.
You mentioned not many places were doing follow-up evaluation to see their equity outcomes. Other than requiring the private companies to share data, are there any other kinds of follow-up evaluation that might capture those outcomes?
I mean, this was the requiring data side. It's hard. I mean, you have to be able to follow up, you need some kind of data. I think in some cases that's often the company side data. Can also be, like I mentioned, sending out surveys to users. I think one thing that can be also particularly valuable, but does require a lot of staff time and resources, which is talking to riders. And so one way to do that would either be, of course, you can stand on the street, but also if you're sending out a survey to riders, say through the micromobility company themselves, you can always ask people, are you willing to participate in a follow-up focus group or interview? And so that's a way to get a population you can talk to more in depth and really ask them about, maybe they've highlighted some barriers or challenges they face to accessing the mode, and you can get more the qualitative side and the lived experience side, which I think surveys don't always capture very well, and which can be incredibly informative. And the only example I'll provide there is I've done separate research on, also NITC research on eliminating cash fares from transit. And I think talking to people about how that would impact their travel experience and their transportation options was incredibly informative, and I think really powerful to thinking about how policies can be shaped to increase accessibility and then therefore mobility for people and use of these modes. So I think talking to people can be a tremendous resource, but I also realize it is an intensive process often for staff who have a lot on their plates.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll go ahead and allow a few more minutes for people to type their questions in the question box. And while we're giving people a chance to ask, I will ask one more thing. I was curious about the mobility needs assessment. I know you mentioned in the report that most of the cities and agencies did not do a mobility needs assessment. And so it seems like that's just not really standard practice. I'm curious about, is that something that's being pushed for in general outside of the micromobility conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was something that we spent a lot of time discussing with our technical advisory committee, a lot of whom are really approaching this from a community empowerment space. And so mobility needs assessment are considered up to date if they've been done in the last 3 to 4 years, which again are big endeavors to undertake for city staff. But yes, they go far beyond micromobility and usually are asking, like, what are your needs? What are your barriers you're facing? I think they're really important because if you're thinking about, you have a lot of tools as a city, micromobility is one of those. But for example, if you're a community and you're saying, sure, scooters are great, but what we really need is safe sidewalks, right? Mobility needs assessment help cities determine where to put their resources, and where to, micromobility might be one tool in that toolbox, but it is unlikely to be the only tool. And so to recognize where it fits in the broader landscape of what communities need in order to access opportunities and travel safely and efficiently across space.
Mhm. There's a few more questions here. I'm going to start with the one on the bottom. Based on your 50,000 foot view, what's one or two cutting edge trends or practices that cities should be thinking about paying attention to?
I'm not sure, Jacob, if you're referring to like specific, micromobility trends, requirements. There's a lot that could be in there, but I'll tell you, I think from a requirement standpoint, I think the trends I think some of the cities are really at the cutting edge of is requiring multiple equity requirements, not just one or two. But again, that gets back to the intersectionality of identities and barriers people face. So for example, providing a reduced rate alone is unlikely to meet, to reduce barriers for everyone. It might be the thing that is a barrier to some, but layering on those equity requirements and dimensions ensures that you're kind of knocking down barriers one at a time. So there's not just there's not a single barrier. And so I think the cities that are implementing multiple are a really important advancement. I think also providing really transparent evaluation to community and to stakeholders is an important piece. So, providing a report and saying, here's what we found, and here's what we're doing in the future to change the practice moving forward. And I think a lot of times that probably happens internally. It's just not external. And I think there's gonna be a lot of buy-in and more support from the community, knowing that they're being listened to. These are being, cities paying attention, and then moving forward. And then from an evaluation side, I think the survey piece, so cities actually sending out a survey to people, is another really something I'm not seeing that much. We didn't see that much of. Wasn't one or two cities, it was more a handful, but again, I think is a really great way to both get kind of the user-based data, so who's using it, not just where, how are they using these modes, but doing it in a way that's lower cost to the city, because you're not having to go find the people. You already have their contact information through the micromobility companies. And so I think that's another kind of best practice I don't see rolled out a lot of places, but I think could certainly be relatively easily implemented in other places.
Great, that was good. So then there's a couple more comments here. Steve Hoyt Macbeth says, I think this is important work, but want to note if you just focus on contractual requirements, it does miss a lot of programs that are either agency or operator.
Yeah, so, and then Steve goes on to mention that there's things like adaptive programs that are run by adjacent programs. 100%, we are not going to capture the full landscape of transportation in this dashboard. I also think it's an important point you raise in general. So especially adaptive vehicles, right? Are these best run or implemented by the private micromobility companies, or are they best run as adjacent programs? I think this is an unanswered question. I think it requires more study. It sounds like it was very effective in Portland, especially with adaptive vehicles, where a single style of adaptive vehicle is not going to meet everyone's needs. And so I think there's some dimensions that outside partnerships could be the most effective answer. So that's a great point, but yeah, not captured in this, unfortunately. And then Rachel asks, government puts a ton of resources into helping automobiles get around, but we expect micromobility providers to do it all. In addition to requirements of providers, are you evaluating what localities put into promote equity that places go above and beyond? We did initially look into cities more broadly. Do cities themselves have, say, equity statements? Do they have equity task force? What else do the cities more broadly, or the agencies like a city department of transportation? What are they doing more broadly on equity? There was an enormous range. I would say it was really hard to even put places into boxes to categorize them. What we have noticed in this research is a lot, in some cases, did come down to the staff themselves. It wasn't necessarily in, written anywhere, but it was staff gumption, essentially, that really took some programs above and beyond. But I'd say there's certainly a lot of different approaches that places have taken. And it's not going to be a single approach. It's going to be, tackling equity from essentially 100 different angles, because again, similar to the requirements, one is not going to, eliminate all barriers. You really need to tackle it from many different dimensions, including, auto access. And that means both thinking about, prioritizing moving people over moving vehicles, and thinking of how we allocate street space, but also thinking about how, and I realize this is a micromobility space, but how cars can actually be a really important piece of the mobility puzzle for people who, don't have good alternative mobility options. Maybe they're living in, the suburbs, maybe they're trying to get to the suburbs for higher paying jobs. But I've done separate research on how, for example, ride hail is a really important piece to kind of stitching together gaps in the mobility system, and thinking, especially in our kind of some of our sprawling built environments, about accessing opportunities across space. So I think there's a lot of different ways to tackle equity. Micromobility is just one piece of it.
Great. Well, I guess we're about there, ready to wrap up, unless someone wants to get in a last minute question. As soon as the webinar ends, you'll receive an email with a link to the video recording and presentation slides. And it'll also have a link to the certificate for anyone who's tracking their professional development hours. And thanks everyone for listening, and thanks, Anne, for a great presentation.
And thanks to you all for joining. And again, links in the chat for if you want to learn more, and please be in touch.